The world's most remote and isolated continent. It's home to glaciers, mountains, plants, and penguins, but today, Antarctica is noteworthy for what it doesn't have. In modern Antarctica, there aren't any trees or native terrestrial mammals, reptiles, or amphibians at all. But it wasn't always like this. Thanks to plate tectonics, Antarctica has been connected to lots of other continents at various points in deep time. As a matter of fact, before the start of the Eocene epoch about 56 million years ago, Antarctica was still joined to both Australia and South America. And the fossil record tells us that in the early Eocene, Antarctica was a warm forested place, very different from the continent we know today. Palm trees thrived there, as did flowering plants, dung beetles, and even a number of hoofed mammals and marsupials. And because of the way it was situated, Antarctica probably served as an important migration path for the ancestors of some of the southern hemisphere's most charismatic mammals, like wallabies and kangaroos. Eventually, of course, the lush environment of Eocene Antarctica transitioned into the cold, glacier-covered landmass that it is today, isolated from the rest of the world by the most powerful ocean currents on the planet. But it turns out that a lot of what we recognize about the southern hemisphere, including those famously unique animals of Australia, can be traced back to the time when Antarctica was green. If you could travel back in time and visit Antarctica in the Eocene epoch, the first thing you'd notice would probably be the greenery. Off the coast of Wilkes Land in eastern Antarctica, scientists have discovered sporomorphs, fossilized pollen and spores from ancient palm trees and ferns. They've also found pollen from other plants that often live in tropical environments today. The traces of these warm weather plants can tell us a lot about what Antarctica was like back then. Since these palms and other trees can't tolerate the cold very well, paleontologists think that in the early Eocene, the coast of Wilkes Land experienced very mild winters with little to no frost. By one estimate, the mean annual temperature of that part of Antarctica was around 16 degrees Celsius, with an average winter temperature of around 11 degrees Celsius. So how could ancient Antarctica have been so warm? Well, for one thing, the Eocene wasn't the first time that Antarctica's climate was so mild. Scientists have found sporomorphs and other fossils from warm weather plants in Antarctica that date back way to the Devonian period, more than 358 million years ago. And in the early Jurassic period, about 190 million years ago, Antarctica was a temperate home for dinosaurs like the long-necked Glacialosaurus and Cryolophosaurus, a crested carnivore. In those days, Antarctica was just one small chunk of the supercontinent Gondwana, and it was located a little farther north than it is now. But by about 100 million years ago, most of the landmass that would become Antarctica had migrated to the bottom of the world. By the early Eocene, the western part of Antarctica had just split from the tip of South America, but the eastern part was still mostly linked to Australia. And right around this time, the world was going through a dramatic heat spike. This event is known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, and we did a whole episode about it, because the theories about what caused it and what made it stop are really complex and fascinating, and a little scary. During this period, the global average temperature increased by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in 220,000 years or less. And as the world's climate changed, so did its flora and fauna. Tropical trees like palms, as well as ferns and tree ferns, were able to spread onto every continent, including Antarctica. And mind you, Antarctica is a really big place. Like, the entire country of Australia can easily fit inside its boundaries. So given its size, it was able to support many different ecosystems in the Eocene. Farther inland and at higher elevations, sporomorphs and leaf impressions have been found from plants that are normally found in temperate rainforests, like the southern beech trees. It's also been suggested that some areas even experienced monsoons, getting more than 60% of their annual rainfall in the summer.
Since humanity first carried out explorations of Antarctica in the late 18th century by James Cook and his crew, the icy continent has given up much of its mysteries over the centuries. Antarctica is the fifth largest continent in the world, almost twice the size of Australia. 99% of its landmass is covered in ice, and it's home to about 70% of our planet's fresh water and 90% of our planet's freshwater ice. Antarctica is the coldest, driest, and windiest continent on Earth. It's a perfect place for ground exploration, and that's why 4,000 scientists are living there. And recently, they found strange anomalies within massive ice sheets of Antarctica. So what is it? And why are scientists worried?
January 2012. The GOI-1 satellite photographs a strange oval formation in a wilderness of ice. Analysis of the image measures the concentric ovals at 400 feet wide. Archaeologist Mark Altaweel takes a closer look.
The kind of thing that when you see it almost anywhere in the world, you say immediately it definitely is man-made.
The rings of the structure look like the walls of some sort of compound, like something that's been designed.
We're in the middle of the Antarctic, so what in the world is that doing there?
The image comes from one of the most remote, untouched regions on Earth, the vast frozen deserts of East Antarctica.
This is in the middle of nowhere, one of the most inhospitable terrains on the planet.
It's the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth. It's thousands of miles from any other civilization.
Investigators consider a possible natural explanation for the phenomenon. Could it be a bizarre ice formation caused by powerful Antarctic winds?
They're called katabatic winds, and they can form these features called sastrugi, equivalent of dunes over snow.
Sastrugi are sharp, wave-like ridges in the snow's surface that run parallel to the direction of the wind. They can form highly unusual shapes, but rarely those visible in the image.
We are probably not looking at sastrugi in this image because the feature here is circular and not long and linear, like the general pattern of sastrugi.
There's another force of nature caused by ice melt in Antarctica that might explain the shape of this feature.
If it was a natural process that explained this feature, my first clue would be those dark splotches.
I would say the dark patches are surface melt. That surface melting tends to pond and form what are called supraglacial lakes.
The surface of these lakes can refreeze, leaving a pool of liquid water under the ice.
If that pond drains out, it will leave a void underneath the ice, which could then collapse inward. And the structure that you see here, you can almost imagine a circular pond that has collapsed inward and created these cracks as the ice could collapse in. Kind of, this is a punch effect.
Collapsing ice could conceivably create similar shapes on a thinly covered pond. But in Antarctica, the ice sheets can be incredibly thick.
3.5 miles of ice covers most of Antarctica.
Ice sheets miles deep are unlikely to collapse.
We can learn a lot from satellite imagery, but without actually going there, we're not going to be able to figure out exactly what this depression is.
We are in the dry valleys, one of the most unusual spots in Antarctica, because it's part of the 1% of the continent that isn't covered by ice.
Instead, here we find craggy mountains. Rock is carved by wind and grit to form impossible-looking sculptures.
It looks more like Mars than Earth.
This makes the dry valleys one of the most scientifically interesting regions to study on the planet.
I think it's a great analog for both Mars and a place like Enceladus.
And here in the dry valleys, Blood Falls is one of the most intriguing features.
Blood Falls is a bit of an obsession for a lot of people. I mean, there's nothing else like this on Earth.
It's like this really visceral feature just jumps out at you, Blood Falls.
It's an outlier, and so we learn from those extremes, right? It's different than anything else we know.
To find out more about this exotic landscape, we've come to Lake Bonny to meet with scientists Jill McCookie and Peter Doran.
You heard that right. This is a lake.
It's really like any other lake on Earth, but there's just a really thick ice cover that stays here all the time.
Peter studies the lakes and streams. He's a hydrogeologist.
Jill is a microbiologist. She studies what's living here.
So there's actually stuff living in the dirt.
Oh yeah, in the dirt and
yeah.
in the lakes, in the lake ice, in the rocks.
There's actually worms in the dirt.
glaciers.
There's microscopic worms, nematodes.
What? I can't believe anything lives here, where it can get down to negative 75 degrees in winter.
What got me interested at first was this notion of how life survives below ice because of other worlds in our solar system. Places like Mars, Europa, or Enceladus. These are going to be really cold places.
So this is running water. That's actually the Blood Falls, actually flowing.
I don't know. We'll see. Let's go find out.
Okay.
I've joined Jill to investigate what exactly Blood Falls is and why she's so fascinated by it.
Those gloves.
It's well below freezing, so I'm surprised to see running water on a day like today. To figure out what's going on, we measure the temperature of the water.
Let's see. Look at that. It's minus 5.2.
Wow.
I need to put my glove back on my hand.
Celsius is how much Fahrenheit? Probably.
You could do that in your voiceover.
Negative 5.2 degrees Celsius is about 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Why is this water flowing almost 10 degrees below the freezing point of water?
Right now, the salinity is reading, I don't know if you can see that, 75 parts per thousand. Oh, 80, there he is. 83 parts per thousand.
What's like ocean water?
35.
Oh, wow. So this is super salty.
This is super salty.
This water isn't frozen because it's so salty. More than twice as salty as ocean water. But that also means something extraordinary about where this water comes from.
The fact that it's so salty tells you it's not glacier melt, right? It has to be coming from somewhere else.
Glacier ice is made of hundreds to thousands of years worth of snowfall. And snow is made of fresh, not salty water. So where is this briny water coming from? Looking around, there's another clue. The red color that makes this feature look bloody.
All the red here is iron oxides. But as you can see, this water here is pretty clear. If the water is clear and there's iron in it, that means it hasn't been oxidized yet. And as it spends time at the surface, that's when it becomes oxidized and leaves this beautiful red color around.
The red crust on this glacier is actually rust. But this means not only is Blood Falls strangely salty, but the Blood Falls brine has also not been exposed to the atmosphere for a very long time. It's from deep below the glacier.
The liquid source below the glacier has potentially been isolated for millions of years. So the next thing to do would be to collect some samples and take this back to the lab and see if there's any microbes in here.
Cool.
These microbes Jill hopes to find could offer insight into what kind of extreme life we might find elsewhere in the solar system. Like on Mars, where we know there's salty liquid below the polar ice.
It's so cool that it's actually flowing while we're here.
Yeah, this is amazing. This is actually quite fortunate. This is a tricky little feature. It doesn't always flow when you'd like it to, I guess. So it's one of those challenging mysteries to study, and it always keeps me guessing.
But what makes Blood Falls actually flow? Why is it only here that we see this bizarre feature? To find out, Peter Doran's team is closely watching its activity with a camera.
Yeah, this camera's been taking photos for the past 2 years, twice a day.
But what is the point of taking a picture of it?
No one really has a super complete record of actual flow events. So the timing of flow events, how often and when it's flowing is actually not really known.
Looking at the time lapse over a few days, you can sometimes spot distinct discharge events. It isn't always flowing.
You could say that Blood Falls isn't regular.
But we don't think there's a yearly cycle. So we're trying to figure out what the cycle is and whether it's connected to seasonality, whether it's connected to maybe even windstorms. My view is Blood Falls is a pressure relief valve, that whenever there's a pressure change by a movement of the glacier, something happens, and sometimes Blood Falls squirts out, sometimes it doesn't.
Peter thinks that Blood Falls flows when there is pressure from the glacier on the underground liquid. Which begs the question, how big is this aquifer that feeds Blood Falls? Is this an isolated system? Or is Blood Falls tapping something bigger? To find out, we have to peer deep below the ice by taking to the skies. A project called SkyTem flies a massive electromagnetic sensor over the area, allowing scientists to peel back the surface and see what lies beneath.
So SkyTem can see hundreds of meters into the ground and tell us the difference between frozen ground and unfrozen ground, and where there's water, where there's groundwater.
SkyTem has revealed that there is much more to the dry valleys than meets the eye. Here, The green shows underground liquid. Lots and lots of it. This part of the dry valleys has an expansive groundwater system.
For the longest time, we didn't think there was groundwater underneath the dry valleys. And so we've always viewed these lakes as being isolated. They weren't connected by any groundwater system. And then we flew the sensor over. We spent 2 weeks flying the sensor around the dry valleys, and it completely changed our perception of water and connectivity in the dry valleys.
So perhaps it's like a deep groundwater system that might exist on Mars. They've recently found a subglacial lake below the southern ice cap on Mars.
And Blood Falls is like a window into this alien environment.
It's a portal into the water beneath the surface of the valley, and it's the first one we've had.
By studying it, scientists may discover clues about how life could evolve and survive in the extreme environments of other planets.
How do you live in the absence of sunlight for extended periods of time? What does that look like? What unique adaptations do these organisms have to be able to survive in cold, darkness, under extremely saline conditions? If we can understand how life operates below ice here, we have a much better chance of maybe knowing where to look or how to look for the life on other worlds.
Result in catastrophic consequences for the area. But what about a place like Antarctica? Well, according to researchers from the University of Chile, the icy area has experienced more than 32,000 quakes over the last 3 months alone. So what has happened as a result? Well, the Bransfield Strait is a 60-mile wide channel near where a few tectonic plates and microplates meet. And the tremors in this area have become so frequent that the strait is widening at an exponentially faster rate than it has in the past. From just 1/3 of an inch in previous years to 6 inches a year now. And at least one of the earthquakes rocked at a 6 magnitude, the largest ever recorded in the region. University of Chile's National Seismological Center's director said about the quakes, it's a 20-fold increase. There are so many earthquakes occurring at once that we are identifying them with automatic pattern recognition systems. But this isn't the area's only change. The peninsula is also the fastest warming spot on the entire planet as well, though experts say there is no evidence yet as to whether these tremors are affecting the polar ice caps.
It also seems pretty weird that in this land of ice, there's an active volcano. How did this volcano come to be?
We're sitting on top of a large feature called the Terror Rift, and that's the source of the volcanism. That's why there's magma coming up near the surface and feeding this volcano.
There's actually a rift zone that runs across western Antarctica. A rift is where a continent is stretching apart and thinning, which allows hot magma to come close to the surface. That's why there's a volcano here that's emitting carbon dioxide. No matter how cold it gets on the surface of Earth, the inside of the planet is still hot. And that's a really good thing, because many scientists think that hundreds of millions of years ago, the whole world was covered in ice. But because volcanoes like this one continue to churn away under the ice, they finally put out enough CO2 to heat up the planet again. So this place isn't only spectacular to visit and study today, but it's also kind of like a window into our planet's past.
Deep beneath the thick layer of million-year-old ice, something is lurking quietly, waiting to rip through the rigid ice sheets. No, not that. This enormous icy wasteland is sitting on top of a volcanic ridge. And in our hypothetical world, these volcanoes are about to wake up. Could their scorching lava wipe out the surface of Earth? Or would the thick Antarctic ice stop the lava before it makes our planet uninhabitable? This is What If, and here's what would happen if Antarctica's dormant volcanoes woke up. Antarctica is the coldest continent on Earth, and it's quite mysterious. We didn't know it had active volcanoes buried underneath it until 2013, when scientists accidentally detected 2 clusters of small earthquakes. Now that we've scanned Antarctica with ice-penetrating radar, we know that there are many more volcanoes hiding below the ice. 138 to be precise. But that's only the ones we know of. How many more could be hibernating there? And how much trouble would we be in if all those volcanoes suddenly decided their slumber was over? It shouldn't be too surprising that these ash-breathing ruptures have been buried underneath Antarctica's ice shield this whole time. After all, volcanoes are easy to come by, even outside our home planet. There are volcanoes on Jupiter's moon Io, Saturn's moon Enceladus, and on our planetary neighbor Venus. But let's not waste our time there. We've got our own world to save. Do you know what happens when a volcano erupts? There are usually warning signs before the real action begins, like the waves of earthquakes. They indicate that there's molten rock moving beneath the surface. Then, lava and ash join the party, accompanied by heated gases. It depends on a variety of scenarios and the kind of lava involved, but on average, lava moves at about 10 kilometers per hour, pretty easy to outrun. But when a major eruption occurs, a volcano releases superheated gases and ash. Combined, they create something called a pyroclastic cloud. These things are hot, reaching up to 700 degrees, and they can move at 80 kilometers per hour. Being trapped by one of these would mean the end of days for you. But Antarctica's volcanoes are a different story. They're buried under layers of ice that are more than 4 kilometers thick in places. We wouldn't be dealing with volcanic gases making their way to the surface, at least as far as one eruption goes. The heat released would melt massive caverns in the ice, creating substantial amounts of meltwater. And that's when things would start getting ugly. The newly created meltwater would cause the ice above it to move more rapidly. The Antarctic ice cover would begin heading into the ocean. From there, the domino effect would kick in. The huge weight of the ice puts all that pressure on volcanoes, keeping them stable. But decrease that pressure, and a volcano gets limbered up, and magma finds a way out through an eruption. In the case of Antarctica, multiple volcanic eruptions could wake up over 100 other volcanoes and destabilize the entire region. As the volcanoes continued to blow their tops, more meltwater would be created, causing more of the Antarctic ice to slide into the ocean. Antarctic ice would be enclosed by warmer ocean currents. On one hand, we'd get a new look at Antarctic bedrock that's been hiding under the ice this whole time. On the other hand, the ice wouldn't just disappear into thin air, it would melt. And if all of Antarctica's ice melted, it would raise the global sea level by about 60 meters.